Hi, this is Kasem. One of the most successful bands of all time is the Police. Yet they almost failed because record companies thought they had no future. Incredible, but true. We'll have the story for you this weekend on American Top 20 from the premier radio networks.
American Top 40.
My name's Bumper Morgan. I'm sitting in for Casey this week on American Top 40. Well, the countdown begins with a debut song. First time on the American charts for this English band. They call themselves Police, and they come in at number 40. Here they are, advising a girl named Roxanne to conserve electricity.
Roxanne.
I'm Charlie Van Dyke, talking the AT40 Talk for Casey Kasem. Now, the story that rock star Sting tells about meeting his all-time music hero. This hero, he told writer Michael Gardner, is that legendary trumpet player, the brilliant, moody Miles Davis. In London a few months ago, when Miles was recording his latest album, a mutual acquaintance offered to take Sting down to the studio to meet Miles. The first thing Miles said to him was, "Do you speak French?" Well, Sting had no idea what was going on, but he answered yes, knowing full well he did not speak French. Then Miles asked him to do a spoken word bit on one of his album tracks. He wanted Sting to read him his rights, as we hear them do so often on various TV police shows. But Miles wanted Sting to shout it in French. And he handed Sting a French translation of, "You have the right to remain silent," etc., etc. Well, Sting said, "Sure, give me 5 minutes." Then he went out to a payphone and called his girlfriend, Trudy, who speaks French very well. She met him at a restaurant a few blocks away and wrote out the French text for him phonetically. A few minutes later, Sting was back in the studio ready to do this little favor for his hero, Miles Davis, on a song called One Phone Call. Here's how it turned out. Now we've heard it all. English rock star Sting of the Police, screaming in French, on a record by American jazz star Miles Davis. When the session was over, says Sting, Miles said to him, "Great to meet you, Sting. See you around." Here's Sting's current hit at number 3. If you love somebody, set them free.
American Top 40.
You're listening to American Top 40. I'm Charlie Van Dyke, sitting in for Casey Kasem. Now, we're up to the week's highest debuter, the new solo hit by Sting, and the story of how he learned that even though music may be the universal language, it doesn't bring a universal response. It happened several years ago when Sting and his former band, The Police, decided to go on a slightly unusual world tour. You see, they booked concerts in countries that at the time hadn't been exposed to a lot of big rock concerts. They played cities like Hong Kong, Cairo, Bombay, Bangkok, Athens, and Mexico City. Sting told Rolling Stone magazine that it seemed like every other country was a surprise. For example, the show in Bombay, India. Sting says the audience had never seen a rock concert before, so they didn't actually know how to behave at one. There was an incredible strata of people, the intelligentsia, the media, beggars, and hippies, and through the show, they just sat there. Nobody said anything. Nobody got up to dance. At the end of the show, there was polite applause, and everybody left. We were told they liked the show, but we weren't really sure. End of quote. Sting says they were definitely sure in Mexico City, but not at first. The Police played in the ballroom of the Hotel de Mexico. The tickets cost $40 apiece, and Sting says most of the crowd were political dignitaries and businessmen. During the concert, waiters served supper. Cigarette girls strolled from table to table. And then, as the show was coming to a close, the audience started throwing their shoes and other pieces of clothing. Now, in some countries, that means get off the stage fast. But in Mexico, it was just the crowd's way of expressing their enthusiasm. And the Police came back for an encore. That's shoe business. Here's former policeman Sting with his latest solo hit, debuting at number 34, We'll Be Together.
American Top 40.
Now we're up to the latest hit by one of the biggest rock stars of the 1980s and the story of how he grew up hating rock and roll. His real name is Gordon Sumner, and he grew up in the industrial town of Newcastle, England, where his father was a milkman and his mother was a hairdresser. He says his family lived in a run-down section of town, and like many working-class kids in England, this young man saw music as his way out. But unlike the members of the Beatles, the Who, or the Rolling Stones, it wasn't rock and roll that Gordon turned to. He says, quote, "I never liked rock music. When I started playing the bass, I played a lot of jazz, Dixieland, mainstream and modern jazz. I thought playing jazz made me better than people playing rock. Well, one night Gordon was playing with a jazz combo at a small club in Newcastle, and there was a drummer in the audience named Stuart Copeland, who was recruiting members for a new band that he was forming. Stuart says while watching the jazz group, he wasn't impressed, but he did see something in their bass player. So after the show, Stuart Copeland introduced himself to Gordon. And over the next few weeks, he also convinced Gordon that jazz and rock had a lot in common. And he talked Gordon into becoming part of his new band. Stewart says, "I have no idea how I did it, but I bamboozled this jazz musician into joining me in a punk band." End of quote. Well, Gordon Sumner adopted a nickname, Sting. And that punk band turned into one of the top rock bands of the 80s, the Police. These days, Sting says he doesn't mind rock and roll at all. But now, here he is solo, sounding like he's getting back to his roots. Jazz roots. At number 11, Sting with We'll Be Together.
American Top 40.
And next up, we have another. He's the big British star with some advice on how to write hit songs. Just crawl into bed, pull up the covers, and fall asleep. This creative sleeper is Sting, who says many of his best ideas for songs come from dreams. That's how he came up with his first solo album, The Dream of the Blue Turtles. And Sting's dreams played an important part in his new album, Nothing Like the Sun. He says, quote, "If you spend half your life asleep, and I know I do, and a lot of that time is spent dreaming, then it must have some purpose." End of quote. Sting believes that dreams provide writers with a source of images and symbols. But there's more to it than just falling asleep, he says. It takes a lot of discipline and effort to remember what you dream. Sting's practiced a lot, and he's come up with a system that works for him. Quote, "You have to keep a notepad by your bed, and just as you're waking up, if you start to write, you start remembering an awful lot. The more you write, the more you remember. It's quite amazing what you actually go through in a night's sleep. It's a wonder you have any rest at all." End of quote. That's Sting on how he turns his dreams into gold and platinum records. Uh-oh, bet he's having dreams about falling this week. His current hit drops 18 notches to number 28.
Casey's Top 40.
I'm Casey Kasem, counting down the hottest hits in the nation.
Number 12.
Falling 3 notches is a man who was once an English teacher and a soccer coach at St. Catherine's Convent School in Newcastle, England. These days, he spends his time writing, singing, and working to free political prisoners and working to save the environment. Here's Sting with All This Time.
Casey's Top 40.
I'm Casey Kasem. Now we're up to the song Fields of Gold. It's by a superstar who got his start playing a bleached blonde punk rocker in a chewing gum commercial. It was back in 1977 that this Englishman had joined forces with Stuart Copeland and Andy Summers to form a trio. They had big hopes of making it, but they were having a terrible time getting started. Punk rock was all the rage in London at the time, and since the music the trio played fell about halfway between classic rock and roll and modern jazz, nobody had much interest in it. So they had to take any work they could find just to pay the bills. One of the jobs that came their way was playing a platinum blonde punk rock band in a British TV commercial, a commercial for chewing gum. It was obviously a big break, but there were 2 problems. First, the band didn't play anything even vaguely like punk rock. And secondly, they weren't blondes. But a job was a job, so they listened to some records and then pretended to play the discordant melodies of punk rock. And when it came to their hair, all 3 members had it bleached, a look they liked so much they stuck with it. As a result of that commercial, they were attacked by real punk rockers as shameless sellouts and frauds. But since they never took punk rock very seriously anyway, they didn't mind that at all. Soon, they were able to start playing their own kind of music, and that led to big hits like Every Breath You Take and Don't Stand So Close to Me. In 1985, their lead singer and main writer launched a solo career that led to smashes like We'll Be Together and If You Love Somebody, Set Them Free. This week, the latest solo hit by the man who got his start playing a platinum blonde punk rocker in a TV commercial is survey song number 16 on Casey's Top 40. Here's Fields of Gold by Sting.
Number 40.
The first of our 3 debuts is a new hit from Sting's platinum CD, 10 Summoner's Tales. It's a song Sting wrote about the trials and tribulations of being in the public eye. In the lyrics, he says that no matter how many times he's analyzed, scrutinized, investigated, or probed by the media, they'll never discover the real person behind his public image. That's why Sting calls this song Nothing About Me.
Casey's biggest hit.
3 years ago this week, one of the biggest hits in the USA was All This Time, the comeback hit for a superstar who lost his ability to write for 3 years and finally got the knack back by returning to his childhood. I'll have details and that big hit after this.
Casey's biggest hits.
3 years ago this week, one of the biggest hits in the USA was the comeback hit for a superstar who lost his ability to write for 3 years and finally got his knack back by returning to his childhood. It was late in 1987 that Sting found he was suffering from a terrible writer's block. He just couldn't seem to write songs anymore. He went to psychiatrists and to hypnotists, but nothing worked, and he says he was getting desperate. Then he went on a trip back to his hometown in England. For days, he walked the streets where he grew up. And one day, watching a ship head out to sea, he began to feel a song welling up in him. A song that brought his ability to write back. 3 years ago this week, that comeback hit was one of the biggest hits in the USA. Here's Sting with All This Time.
Casey counts them down.
Now we're up to Sean Colvin, one of a bunch of stars who recorded a favorite childhood song for a benefit CD to save the rainforest. For 8 years now, Sting and his wife Trudy Styler have worked hard to educate people about the danger of cutting down the trees in the Great Rainforest, the rainforest that cuts across the heart of South America. The forest is called the lungs of the world because so much of the oxygen we breathe is produced there. But at the current rate of deforestation, Sting cautions, it won't be long before there are no trees left in the rainforest. To help get the word out this year, Sting and Trudy have compiled a CD called Carnival. The CD features top international stars like Madonna, Paul Simon, and Reuben Blades, who all contribute new songs, while performers like Elton John, Sean Colvin, Tina Turner, Luciano Pavarotti, and Annie Lennox sing traditional folk songs and childhood favorites.
Casey's biggest hits.
12 years ago this week, back in 1985, one of the biggest hits in the USA was from the first solo album by Sting, an album where he set himself apart from the police by using a backup band of jazz musicians. I'll have details and that big hit after this.
Casey's biggest hits.
12 years ago this week, back in 1985, one of the biggest hits in the USA was from the first solo album by Sting, an album where he set himself apart from the police by using a backup band of jazz musicians. It was back in 1985 that the trio called The Police officially came to an end. The band's bass player, Sting, had been lead singer on all the group's songs, and it was apparent that he was going to have the most successful solo career of any of the group's members. But it was also important to Sting that his solo debut wasn't perceived as just more of the Police. And so he hired some of the top jazz men around to play for him, including Branford Marsalis, Kenny Kirkland, and Omar Hakim. The result was a highly acclaimed album and a song that was one of the biggest hits in the USA 12 years ago this week. Here's Sting and Love is the Seventh Wave.
American Top 20.
Well, now we're up to the theme from the movie The Three Musketeers, a song performed by a trio of superstars, two of whom have been crossing swords for years. The friendly feud between Rod Stewart and Sting goes back more than a decade. Both of them are hardcore practical jokers. And ever since they met at a benefit concert in the early 80s, they've been playing pranks on each other that have increased in complexity. One time, Sting greased Rod Stewart's microphone so the singer couldn't hold on to it. Another time, Rod Stewart filled Sting's dressing room with shaving cream. Well, Sting retaliated by gluing the door to Rod's dressing room closed. Well, when the two British superstars finally agreed to work together on the theme from The Three Musketeers, people thought they'd go at each other tooth and nail. But as it turned out, neither challenged the other to a duel. It seemed they were tired of making each other miserable. In fact, not only did they make up, Sting admitted to Rod that he'd always been a huge fan of his, despite all the awful things Rod had done to him over the years. So it really was all for one and one for all, as Rod Stewart and Sting joined with Bryan Adams to sing this Top 10 smash from 1993. Here's All for Love.
America's Top 10 hits.
6 years ago this week, back in 1993, one of the top hits in the USA was a song recorded by Sting in the kitchen of his English country home. A recording that won the Grammy for Best Engineered Album. Usually that award goes to an album recorded under the most demanding of conditions in a state-of-the-art studio. But in this case, Sting loved the acoustics in his ancient kitchen of his English country home. He set up a makeshift studio in there to record the album 10 Summoner's Tales. And the great irony of the award is that it beat out albums recorded in the most up-to-date studios around, which proves that sometimes a good sound can be found anywhere, even in the kitchen. Here's Sting with a song from that well-recorded album. 6 years ago this week, it was one of the top hits in the USA. Fields of Gold.
America's top hit.
7 years ago this week, back in 1993, one of the top hits in the USA was by a star who grew up sharing a single bedroom with his three brothers with a bathroom in the hall. But now he lives in a 400-year-old house with 14 bedrooms and 8 baths. It's been a long journey for Sting from the working class of Newcastle to a castle of his own southwest of London. But he's made it in style. Along with all those bedrooms and bathrooms, he also has 2 dining halls, a library, a drawing room, and a boathouse. And Sting says that for the first time in his life, he feels as if he's in a home he can and will spend the rest of his days in. A home he could be singing about in a song that was one of the top hits in the USA 7 years ago this week. Here's Sting with Fields of Gold.
Counting them down with Kasem.
Now, we're up to an American Top 10 Extra by The Police, a band that was recently turned inside out by a documentary shot from the inside out. The filmmaker is Stuart Copeland, who was the drummer for The Police and the founder of the group. From 1977 through 1986, Stuart carried a portable Super 8 movie camera with him everywhere he went. He shot hundreds of hours of film, backstage, in the studio, and on the road. 20 years after the band broke up, he decided it was time to do something with that footage, and he turned it into a rockumentary that's, quote, as honest as I can be. It shows us, warts and all. I wanted people to know what it was really like. According to the film, titled Everyone Stares the Police Inside Out, it wasn't easy. But in the midst of one argument after another, the band also created some great music, including the #1 song of the year 1983. With an extra, here's The Police with Every Breath You Take.
American Top 20.
Now, we're up to an American Top 20 Extra by The Police, a band whose guitarist says it's amazing they've had any success at all. As the hugely successful reunion tour of The Police comes to an end, the band members have been doing a lot of interviews, and in those interviews, they've been unusually honest. In one interview with CNN, guitarist Andy Summers says when he looks back on the band's 30-year history, none of it makes any sense. Quote, we didn't get along from the beginning. Each of us has a vision of what the band should be like, and those visions aren't the same. We were fighting in the 70s, and we're fighting now. When you get right down to it, you know, we're jerks. But Andy also says that out of those fights came some terrific music. Music like this smash from 1984, with an extra, The Police and Wrapped Around Your Finger.
American Top 20.
Well, now we're up to an extra by The Police, a superstar band whose record company had so little faith in them, they thought sending them on tour was a waste of time. It was back in 1978 that The Police released their first album. The band's record company didn't think there were any hits on the album, and they especially disliked Roxanne, which they thought was depressing. When the band asked for a budget to pay for a tour, the record company turned them down. But The Police weren't ready to give up. They booked the tour themselves. They slept on the floor in cheap hotels. They traveled in an ancient station wagon that kept breaking down. Sting says, we were the only people who believed in ourselves, and even we had doubts. It took a long time, but we finally started to catch on. In fact, they didn't just catch on, they caught fire. Now, here are The Police with an extra from 1981, Every Little Thing She Does Is Magic.